Welcome to another episode of the FMCG Guys. I'm Daniel Torres, founder of Dwyer Partners Executive Search, joined again by the one and only Efrain Rosario.
Hi, Daniel. Good to see you again, as always.
Good to see you too. So we were just talking about the fact that it's practically 2 years since we were hit by something that may ring a bell to people called COVID.
I think it's still pretty top of mind for a lot of people. I don't think we're quite through it yet, but yeah, it's hard to believe that it's been almost 2 years since our lives were completely turned upside down. Daniel, thinking back on that, what's like your one memory from that first few months of when we all went into confinement and lockdown?
Yeah, well, apart from the fact that I was starting my search firm right at that time, and then I went to the notary the last day the notary actually opened before they...
Good timing.
Yeah, amazing timing. Apart from that, I remember it being, I think it was like Wednesday or Thursday that week. No, it was Wednesday because there was Champions League on. I went to the supermarket to buy some stuff, like some beer and so on, to watch it at home. And like all these empty shelves already. And there, things went so fast that even if it was Wednesday and they announced the lockdown on Friday, it was kind of unimaginable at that stage that there would be like a full-on lockdown like we'd seen it happen in China.
Yeah. I mean, I think kind of like you, I remember going into the grocery store or the local market where I used to live in Paris and coming to terms with the fact that I couldn't find certain staples like flour, for example. Little did I know that everybody would all of a sudden want to become a bread maker.
Not to mention toilet paper, of course, which I think was kind of universal. No, it's something that put the world together. Everybody looking for toilet paper was pretty unique.
Well, I think in both, well, there are certain things that are similar and certain things that are different about those two products. I think on one hand, both of those things are obviously essentials that people are still continuing to use today.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think that toilet paper usage or consumption, let's say, was something that was actually, regardless of the fact that, let's say, demand for purchase of those things went through the roof because people were stockpiling, the actual consumption or usage of that product was actually pretty consistent pre and post pandemic. I think what's different about flour is like, as I mentioned, everybody all of a sudden became a bread maker and started to make, banana bread and sourdough and all these kinds of things. But I think that's something that we've actually kind of seen consumption of that product or that category has actually kind of come back down to, let's say, pre-pandemic levels now. I don't think everybody who was an aspiring bread maker in 2020 has remained...
has
remained one in 2022. So I think, but I think what that does is that it really illustrates the need to be able to, in essence, try to manage your out of stocks, right?
Yeah.
And doing it in an effective way.
Yeah. Interestingly, Efrain, we ran a survey a couple of weeks ago on our LinkedIn page, which, by the way, I remind our users to follow us on LinkedIn. You just have to search for the FMCG Guys and press the follow button. We ran a survey asking about what would the main challenge be for business leaders in FMCG and retail in 2022. Rising commodity prices came in number one with 39%. Talent retention came in number two, which I was happy to see, with 36%. And then COVID and its restrictions came in third at 18%. So maybe we are turning a page.
Maybe. Well, I think to the point of the results of that survey, I think today's guest is going to really be very interesting in regards to some of what she has to share about her approach or her company's approach to demand planning and being able to manage inventory levels more effectively.
Yeah, because today our guest is Veena Giridhar Gopal, CEO of salesBeat, which is a company that helps plan demand so you never run out of stock, and not only based on last year's data, but also based on socio-environmental factors.
The way I think of it is predictive versus prescriptive analytics.
Hi, Veena. Thanks for joining the show. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Very good as well. Very good. Hi, Efrain.
Hi, Daniel. Always good to be here with you. Hi, Veena.
Hi, Efrain.
So Veena, to help the audience get a bit acquainted with you, tell us a bit about yourself and your background and what you're doing currently.
So I'm Veena. I have about 20 years or more in the fast-moving consumer goods sector, having worked for companies like Pepsi, Diageo, a wine company in between, and some consulting for retail experience in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm a co-founder of salesBeat, and we have an AI-driven platform that tells salespeople how much to sell to retailers, wholesalers, distributors, convenience stores, and the like.
And by AI, you mean artificial intelligence, right?
Yes. So we basically look at all kinds of external data and in quantums that people don't currently process because it's not humanly possible. It processes all the data and it tells salespeople how much their retailers should be buying so they can discuss those orders with them.
Well, Veena, just to jump into it, before we started recording, we were talking about our shared COVID experiences. And I have to imagine, given what you told us about salesBeat, that you have an interesting perspective in regards to how COVID has impacted not just the lives of consumers, but also of sales teams. And if you think about their clients as well.
Yep. So interestingly, COVID is one of those situations that no one can even predict. And what happens with sales is people look at what happened in previous years to get an understanding of how people behave in future years. And that's how they sell. And they basically look at last year's data and go for an uplift on last year's data, which is a certain percentage higher than last year's data. And that's how they sell into supermarkets, wholesalers, distributors, and the like. Whereas with COVID, even just with normal human behavior, we don't think about that. But with COVID, it's just changed the way people live so much. People don't work at offices anymore. They stay at home, which means they cook a lot more at home. So you're buying things like oil, cooking spices, flour, ingredients, vegetables, and making your own food, versus when you go to the office, you're buying it. So there's a massive difference in how people buy from supermarkets, and it's not factored into how people sell at the moment. So it impacts salespeople as well, because they're not selling the right quantities. So their execution in store is not great because you have empty shelves there when they could have actually bridged that and sold a lot more into supermarkets to meet demand.
Well, and I think you mentioned the three most dreaded words for a lot of consumers during the holiday period, which is out of stock.
Yes.
And that I think that we can't overestimate the impact that has had in terms of both consumers' lives, but also obviously in terms of like manufacturers as well. In terms of like, we used to, in my previous life, talk about out of stock as the next billion-dollar brand. It's so significant.
Yeah. So interestingly, we have a Twitter site called @OutOfStock where we retweet people's out of stocks just so we can highlight how this is such a common and big problem.
Well, we'll make sure that we put that in the description of the episode so they can follow your Twitter account as well. Why do certain products actually run out of stock? Like, what causes that?
Unexpected demand that sounds very simple and it sounds very basic. And it's probably not what you're asking, but there's various different things that influence it. So the example that I like giving is when there's a heat wave, ice creams go out of stock. In the beverages world, you have beer going out of stock, white wines going out of stock. Anything that's like lemonade goes out of stock because that's what people want when there's a heat wave outside. They cool themselves down with that. Certain things that are less obvious are when there's a heat wave, after a couple of months, you have shower gels going out of stock. You have laundry detergents going out of stock. So there are a few not very obvious influences as well. And then you have social media, which influences this quite a bit. So there were campaigns done on TikTok by L'Oreal for a product called Infallible, and it went out of stock at several stores in the US. The campaign that was done on Twitter by Kraft Heinz and Weetabix, that went viral. And both Kraft Heinz and Weetabix went out of stock. Now, it's a very interesting campaign because they spoke about the combination of Weetabix with Heinz beans. Yes, very polarizing. So, but people did look at it. and it did go out of stock. So it sort of talks to the power of social media, which none of us have looked at or have prepared for.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think some of the folks that I work with, we like to say that, it's almost impossible to predict the future, but we can at least understand what's possible and try to anticipate that realm of possibility for these kinds of things. That being said, it sounds like you alluded to a couple of brands already, but how have certain brands and retailers addressed that out of stock challenge, particularly during the pandemic? And I guess you mentioned some of the cases where it didn't work quite as well. Do you have some examples of where other brands maybe tried a different approach and it worked a little bit better than the ones you mentioned?
Yeah, so there's an interesting one by Associated British Foods. So the bulk of their business is selling large-scale volumes of flour into the on-trade, so restaurants, these sort of kiosks and that sort of thing, so that they can make their food and sell it. Now, those are all shut during the first lockdown. And I think the second lockdown as well, if I remember right. So what these guys did, which was brilliant of them, is they turned around and said, okay, we have all of this flour sitting there and people are into baking now. So people were baking banana bread, they're doing sourdoughs, and there was massive demand for flour in supermarkets. So those guys turned around, made smaller SKUs of supermarket-ready products, branded it, and sold it in supermarkets. So they did it really well. So they were basically keeping up to date with what consumers wanted and gave them exactly that when there was a pandemic going on and they couldn't sell their existing stock into restaurants and bars and pubs and wherever else they used to sell it to.
Yeah, that's a great pivot from one channel to the other, which it's just another layer of complexity as well.
Exactly. Yeah. But obviously they were listening to consumers. So.
But how have they, traditionally, when companies have run out of stock, what's been the typical answer of consumer goods companies to sudden rise of demand of stock? For example, talking about the pandemic, but that's an exceptional situation. But we all remember when there was no toilet paper. But whenever there was a heat wave and ice cream ran out, what's been the traditional way of these companies trying to avoid these situations? Just looking at last year's, is that the only thing they do?
It's basically the only thing they do at the moment because they don't have anything else that can predict how consumers do better. So they spend a lot of time looking at how consumer behavior and consumer analysis is big in a lot of companies. You have shopper marketing teams, you have consumer marketing teams, but that sort of stays within the marketing segment. It doesn't move from marketing into sales. So that sort of bridge is not made. And that's one of the reasons why they miss out on these opportunities. And at the end of the day, when these stockouts happen, it's the consumer who actually misses out the most because they can't find the brand they want. The company, as long as they are still making their monthly, quarterly, half-yearly, or annual targets, to them, it's not such a huge deal. They talk about out of stocks, but the fact is there's a lot of inertia within the company to do something about it because there is no obvious solution to fix it, which is one of the reasons we thought this would be a good thing to focus on when COVID started happening.
Yeah. So that's actually a great segue to the next question I was going to ask, which is that, can you tell us a little bit more about salesBeat and how you guys address this challenge head on, working with brands and manufacturers?
Sure, no problem. So we launched our platform in early to mid 2020, and we launched it to eliminate out of stocks. And the way we do it is look at lots of different factors and influences on consumer behavior. And we collect data on that. We map that to previous consumer sales data, so what we call depletions or store sales data for each SKU, and then map it to if these factors change to different values, how would consumers then behave? Because there's a relationship that's established already. We look at things like weather forecasts, home rental, home sales, social media. So we scrape social media for what people are saying about each brand or each SKU, whether there's positive mentions, negative mentions, whether a campaign is trending, and at what what stage it gets to a tipping point, because at that tipping point, usually this is an upsurge in sales. We look at things like, how are people commuting to work? Is there a road closure in a certain place? Because that would dictate consumers go and shop at a different store and companies who think about selling to a different store. So those are some of the examples that we look at.
Yeah. I mean, I think to me, what stuck with me was you talked about really moving into that predictive analytics space from what we typically think about as more prescriptive analytics, which are more historically based, as opposed to this, which is more forward-looking.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it is. So we apply the relationship to the future because you can't fix the past. It's gone. So all you can do is prepare for the future.
Yeah. I mean, if you could, then you would have helped me find flour all those times I was looking for it during the
Yeah.
So Veena, what business results can predictive analytics bring to the table? Because we've talked a lot about like all the different factors that are not taken into account when we think about demand and we plan for demand, that we were basically what brands are just looking at last year's results. How can predictive analytics bring value to the table?
There's a few different ways we can do that. So one is what we call the optimal volume recommendations for sales. What it does is it helps the salesperson sell the right levels of stock to the customer, so it doesn't go out of stock in retail. The next one is a less obvious one, but it helps a salesperson understand how much to sell so they don't overstock with their customer, because that's equally important. Eventually, that stock is going into a sale where it's sold at a reduced price or even destroyed, in which case the company needs to pay money to be destroying that product. So both are really bad, and we tell them how not to do that or what to do in those cases. The next one that we do is we can tell them what is the optimal promotion to implement at stores, because usually there's a particular demographic that shops at each store, and each of those demographics like a certain type of promotion. And not every single promotion, when finance people look at it, they don't look at the demographics of the store. They make assumptions and then look at what the output of that promotion is. If it makes sense, they apply it. We do something similar, but we look at the demographics as well and then apply the uplifts to the sort of financials to understand what the profitability or the revenues generated is. And so we can actually do that as well. We can also let them know which new products to launch in which markets, where they'll see the most amount of demand, what's the perfect test market to launch something into before they expand, and that sort of thing.
I mean, those are all amazing use cases that I think a lot of brands would find really, really helpful in terms of things to optimize their business, particularly on, let's call it, harder market conditions. Is there anything else that's on the horizon? Like, what's next in terms of some of the things you guys are thinking about, trying to anticipate future use cases of things that you may go try and solve next?
So one of the things that we are looking at is how we can put in place an inventory management system that is perfectly in sync with the sales intelligence platform. So it's, to be perfectly clear, it's not about demand planning, because that's not an area that we are currently looking at, but it's more an inventory management system to help the retailer understand what levels of stock he or she has. Because a lot of the retailers that we've spoken with, especially the sort of medium-sized and the mom and pop ones, they don't have any systems in place. So we are looking at whether we can help them with that by implementing a solution that has sales intelligence coupled with an inventory management system as well.
I think it's really smart of you all from a business standpoint to be looking at that small to medium-sized business opportunity. I think that's one that's in many industries often neglected. Well, they're just more fragmented, but at the same time, ripe with opportunity, just because, like you mentioned, they don't have some of those resources that the larger retailers, for example, would have at their disposal. So they're the ones who are in most need of these kinds of solutions.
As a headhunter, Veena, I'm curious to know, like, and top of mind, because I know that you're not, from like a talent management point of view, like we're talking about like commercial teams, we're talking about demand planning department, which sits between supply chain and commercial. Do you think that predictive analytics in the way of not running out of stock or adjusting to demand more than anything, do you think it will have an impact on the type of executives that companies have in these departments?
It really depends, is what I'd say, because I think what this does, what our intelligence does, is it frees salespeople up from having to do complicated analytics of data. So a lot of the times, if you're a really good salesperson, you're looking at these factors already and then preparing for that. And what we help is move that this salesperson is okay. He's got really good people skills, or she's got really good people skills, but she doesn't have the data analytics skills that lets her look at this data and come up with conclusions. We move that profile of person to a really great salesperson by being able to give them data-driven recommendations that they don't need to spend ages to interpret or ages looking at. So I think that's where we bring the difference. So you can actually then recruit, or the companies can recruit someone who's perfectly suited to selling than perfectly suited to number crunching and selling.
I think what salesbeat does quite well is you to make the very complex simple for those sales teams, which is, I think, something that we can all strive for in all walks of life, because there's enough complexity in our lives. So Veena, this has been great. And I know that I've learned a lot about the various types of analytics that you've walked us through. So for companies, for people in our audience who want to learn more about salesbeat and the kinds of solutions that you all can provide, what's the best way for them to reach out to you? How can they find out more about salesbeat?
We have our website, www.salesbeat.co. And if anyone would like to learn more, you can click on schedule a demo and basically say you'd just like to learn more and you're not there to do a demo, and happy to have a chat about salesbeat, what we do. Or you can reach out to me on veena@salesbeat.co.
Well, we'll make sure that we put all that information in the liner notes for the episode so that they have, so people who are interested in finding out more can get a hold of you.
That sounds good.
Yeah, and a shout out to the audience as well to mention that they're coming from the FMCG guys, of course.
Yes.
Hey, Veena, I wanted to ask you finally, like, thinking back on your career, because I know that you did quite a long career in FMCG, like within the industry before starting your own business. If you went back to the beginning of your career, what one piece of advice would you give to your younger self at that stage?
I think the one thing that I would tell her is ask for help, because someone has done this before. Don't try and reinvent the wheel, because that's going to be a lot more complicated and complex. Someone's done it before, so asking for help doesn't actually hurt. It just makes the process faster.
This was Veena Giridhar Gopal, CEO of salesbeat, a company that helps plan demand, as you heard, so you never run out of stock. Ephraim, what are your takeaways from this interesting conversation with Veena?
Yeah, I think it was lots of rich conversation. I know I've learned a lot just in Veena sharing her story and the story of salesbeat. I think the first thing that stuck out to me was thinking about building your analytics capabilities, both for marketing and for sales, and doing it in a way that's built around the capacity and capabilities for each of those individual groups, because obviously the dynamics of a salesperson on a day-to-day basis is very different than it is for a marketer. And recognizing those differences and adapting your analytics solutions to meet both those needs is really, really important.
Yeah, and along these lines, I think also the fact that this impact that it will have on sales and marketing will also have implications on talent management, i.e. your org chart or the type of executives you will want in marketing or sales. No, maybe they'll be looking for people that maybe not can crunch the numbers, but as Veena was saying, can actually understand the numbers and find the right tools to use analytics in the day-to-day.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I always think of it is that data is the common language, but there are certain various dialects of that language that are spoken based on just the realities of the context of the role that you're in, for sure. The second thing that caught my attention was when Veena was telling us about this natural evolution from prescriptive analytics to predictive analytics, and really thinking about how they're really taking an approach with salesbeat of looking at a lot of these, let's call it external as well as internal factors, to be able to, in essence, look forward as opposed to backwards based solely on historical data.
I wanted to thank our audience for joining us today. Remember that you can follow us on our usual channels, our website, our LinkedIn. Also, thanks to and a shout out to our partners in the US, the CPG guys, and we'll see you on the next episode of the FMCG guys.